Snow was still falling when Corinna Hale realized she'd been holding the same coffee mug for 20 minutes without drinking from it. The cafe was empty except for her. 6:47 in the morning, an hour before the first customers arrived, and she was standing behind the counter in her apron watching the street outside fill with January white. Her daughter was upstairs asleep. The rent was paid. The espresso machine had been repaired last week after 3 days of genuine panic. Things were fine. So why did her chest feel like someone had pressed a hand flat against her sternum and refused to move? Her phone buzzed on the counter. She didn't look at it. She already knew who it was. Damian Voss had a way of occupying space even when he wasn't in the room. She'd learned that 4 years ago, when he'd first walked into this cafe on a Tuesday afternoon in October and ordered an Americano without looking at the menu. Tall, dark coat. The kind of stillness that didn't read as calm so much as contained, like something was happening underneath the surface that he'd gotten very good at not showing. She'd been short with him because she was tired and running the counter alone, and he'd tipped 40% anyway and come back the next day, and the day after that, until coming back every day stopped being a coincidence and started being something else entirely. She'd been 29 and freshly out of a marriage that had lasted 2 years longer than it should have. She'd had a 4-year-old and a lease on a building she could barely afford, and exactly no room in her life for whatever Damian Voss was suggesting by showing up with that expression and that 40% tip every morning like clockwork. She'd told herself that every day for 8 months. Then one evening in June, after she'd locked the front door and turned around to find him still sitting at the corner table with 2 glasses of wine he'd brought himself because she didn't have a liquor license. She'd sat down across from him, and they'd talked until 2 in the morning about things she hadn't told anyone. Her father's death, the marriage, the specific loneliness of building something alone and not being sure if you were building it right. He'd listened like he was taking inventory, like every word mattered enough to keep. She'd thought, this is dangerous. She'd thought, I don't care. What she should have asked, what she hadn't thought to ask until much too late, was what kind of man spent that much time in a neighborhood cafe in the West End of Toronto without anyone around him ever calling to check where he was. The coffee went cold. She poured it out and made herself a fresh cup. Upstairs, she heard the creak of small feet crossing the floor. Ella. 8 years old now, with her father's curly hair and Corinna's stubbornness, and an opinion about every single thing, which Corinna found exhausting and quietly wonderful in equal measure. A door opened and closed. The bathroom. Then silence again. Corinna breathed. The phone buzzed a second time. She turned it face down. She'd been with Damian for 14 months before she understood what he actually was. Not because he'd hidden it exactly. In retrospect, the signs were obvious in the way things are always obvious once you already know. The men who sometimes waited outside. The phone calls he took by stepping to the far end of whatever room they were in, his back turned, voice dropped to something she couldn't hear. The way he moved through certain parts of the city like he owned them, which she would come to understand he more or less did. Not through deeds and property taxes, but through a different kind of arrangement entirely. He ran money. That was the cleanest way to put it. He moved it, cleaned it, made it disappear, and reappear looking like something legitimate. He sat at the center of something that spread across Toronto and Hamilton, and had roots in Montreal, and he'd built it with 15 years of careful, invisible work. She'd found out because of a folder she was never supposed to see. Not hidden exactly, just left on his kitchen table while he was in the shower, in a home she'd been spending 3 nights a week in for nearly a year. She'd opened it out of reflex, the way you move someone's newspaper so you can set down your cup, not thinking. Then she'd read the first page, and her hands had gone very still, and she'd read the second page, and by the third, she understood what the stillness she'd always found compelling in him actually meant. She'd closed the folder and put it back exactly as she'd found it. She'd said nothing at dinner. She'd driven home and sat in her car outside her building for 4 or 5 minutes before going upstairs to relieve her neighbor who'd been watching Ella. She'd waited 2 weeks. She didn't know why exactly. Fear, maybe, or the part of her that had been trained by marriage to keep quiet and observe and try to understand a situation completely before she blew it up. But eventually she'd asked him. Directly, sitting across from him at a restaurant table on a Saturday night, hands flat on the white tablecloth, she'd asked, "What exactly do you do, Damian?" He'd set down his fork. He hadn't lied to her. She would give him that. He hadn't dressed it up or softened it or claimed it was something it wasn't. He'd told her the truth in the same even, careful voice he used for everything, watching her face the whole time with an expression that looked like it was braced for something. Then she'd ask the question she should have led with. Did any of this put Ella at risk? And he'd said no, absolutely not. She was separate from all of it. She always would be. He'd made certain of that. And she had asked, "How can you make certain of something like that?" And he'd said, in the same quiet voice, "Because I'm careful." She should have left then. She knew that. She'd known it sitting at that table, and she'd known it every day since, including this one. But Ella had started calling him Damian instead of your mom's friend Damian by that point, and he'd come to 2 school events and fixed the radiator in the upstairs apartment she rented out, and she was 31, and she had not felt this known by another person since her father died. So she'd told herself that careful meant something. She'd told herself that separate was a real category. She'd told herself that for another 8 months. Then 3 weeks ago, 2 men had come into the cafe. Not customers. She knew the difference. They'd sat in the corner booth and ordered nothing, and watched her work the counter for 40 minutes before one of them came up and put a card on the counter with a name and a number on it and said, "Tell Damian that Forsyth says hello." She'd looked at the card. She'd looked at the man. She'd said, "I don't know anyone named Damian." The man had smiled in a way that had nothing to do with friendliness and said, "Of course you don't. Just a message." She'd called Damian the moment they left. He'd been there in 18 minutes, which should have been comforting, except that it meant he'd been close by. He'd looked at the card and gone very still, not his usual stillness, something different, something with an edge, and told her it was nothing, someone testing. She shouldn't worry. She'd said there were 2 of them, and one watched the window the whole time, not the room. He'd looked at her. She'd felt him revising something. He'd said, "I'll handle it." She'd said, "They know where I work, Damian." He'd said, "I know. I'm sorry. I'll handle it." She'd said, "Do they know where I live?" The pause before he answered lasted exactly long enough. She'd asked him to leave. He'd gone. He'd texted that night, and the night after, and every day since. Not pressure exactly, not demands, just presence. The same way he'd shown up every morning for coffee in the early days. Persistent and patient and absolutely certain that she would come around. She wasn't sure anymore if that certainty was about love or about control. She wasn't sure he knew the difference either. Ella came downstairs at 7:15 in her school uniform, with her hair only half done, which was standard, and climbed onto the stool at the counter and asked for hot chocolate, which Corinna made while Ella described a dream involving a horse that could also breathe underwater. "Is that scary?" Corinna asked. "No," Ella said, deeply offended by the question. "It's a friendly horse. Sure, it rescues people who fall off boats. Practical." Ella looked at her mother with the particular attention children deployed when they sense something. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, love." "Tired." "You're always tired." "Yes, you should sleep more." "Thank you, Ella. That is excellent and very actionable advice." Ella considered this, decided she was being made fun of, and turned her attention back to her hot chocolate with dignity. Corinna watched her and felt the familiar thing. That specific ache of loving someone so much it sat in your chest like a stone. Not unpleasant, just waited. Her phone buzzed again. Ella looked at it, then at her mother. Corinna picked it up and read the message. "I need to see you. Not to change your mind. Just to explain something. 1 hour. You pick the place." She put the phone face down again. Ella finished her hot chocolate. Corinna did her hair. They went through the routine of school bag and snack and coat and boots and the 3-block walk to the school door, and Corinna hugged her daughter at the gate and watched her run in, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the January cold feeling the shape of her own life pressing in on her from every direction. She typed back, "The café, 10 a.m., you have 30 minutes. He arrived at 9:58, which was Damian, precise even when the situation didn't require it. He looked tired in a way she'd never seen before. Not physically. Something else. Like he'd been running a calculation for weeks and kept arriving at an answer he didn't want. She brought him coffee without asking. He took it without commenting. They sat across from each other at the corner table, his table. In her head, it had always been his table, which was a problem she hadn't solved, and she waited. He said, "The man who sent Forsyth's card, his name is Leonard Atcheby. He's been building a case against my operation for 8 months. Not law enforcement. Competitor. He wants what I've built, and he's decided the fastest way to get it is to pressure the people around me." She said, "And I'm one of the people around you." He said, "You were. I thought I'd built enough distance. I was wrong." She noticed he said were. She said, "What does that mean for Ella?" He said, "Nothing. I've made arrangements. There's someone watching the school. There's someone watching this building. Neither of them will ever be visible to you. That will continue as long as necessary, regardless of anything else." She said, "Regardless of anything else." He said, "Yes." She said, "Damian." He said quietly, "I'm not here to convince you to stay. I understand what I put you in the path of, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you it was worth the risk because it wasn't my risk to make for you. You didn't know. You should have known. I should have told you before it got to here, and I didn't, and that's on me, not you." She looked at him. He said, "I do want to tell you something, and then I'll go." She waited. He said, "I know the version of this conversation where I say, I'll step back from all of it, walk away from the whole operation, go legitimate, turn evidence if that's what it takes. And I want you to know that I'm not saying that because it's the thing you'd want to hear. I'm saying it because I've been sitting with it for 3 weeks, and it's the only version of the future I can actually see where I'm someone Ella could know, where I'm someone you could know without it costing you something." Corinna's throat tightened. She said, "That's a long way from done." He said, "I know. It might take a year. It might take longer, and it might get very complicated in the middle, and I can't promise you what the other side looks like." She said, "Are you asking me to wait?" He said, "No. I'm asking you to know what I'm doing and why. After that, it's yours." She looked at his hands around the coffee cup. She'd always noticed his hands. They were careful the way he was, deliberate, never careless. She'd thought for a long time that carefulness was the same as safety. She was less sure of that now. She said, "You need to go." He stood. He left $60 on the table, which was absurd for 2 coffees and also entirely characteristic, and he walked out the door and down the street, and she watched him go. Her first customer came in at 10:23. She made lattes and a chai and a pour-over for a woman who changed her mind twice, and she did not think about Damian Voss for almost 45 minutes. The arrangements he'd mentioned turned out to be real. She noticed the first one 3 days later, a man who sat in the park across from the school at pickup every afternoon, different bench each time but always there, always angled toward the gate. He never looked at her directly. He never looked at Ella. He looked at everything else the way she imagined someone might look at a space they were responsible for. It made her feel watched and protected at the same time, which were not feelings she had experienced combining. She found out about Atcheby 2 weeks after that. Not from Damian. From the news, a business section article about a commercial real estate firm under investigation for fraud. The name Leonard Atcheby appearing in the 3rd paragraph, with the careful language journalists used when criminal charges were pending but not yet filed. She read it 3 times. She didn't call Damian. She thought about her father, who'd been an orderly man, a man who believed in systems and institutions, and the idea that if you followed the rules would follow back. He'd died at 62 still believing that. She'd loved him for it, even when she'd known, in the way you know things you don't say out loud, that the world didn't particularly care whether you played fair. Damian had never believed in systems. He'd built his own. That was the terrifying part. And also, she understood now, sitting in her kitchen at 11 at night with a glass of wine she'd forgotten to drink, the part she'd been drawn to. Someone who looked at the structures everyone else relied on and had simply decided to operate outside them. It was dangerous and arrogant, and she could see exactly how she'd mistaken that kind of confidence for something safe. She called him. He picked up on the second ring. She said, I saw the article. He said, yes. She said, is it done? He said, mostly. The parts that matter. She said, Damian, I need you to answer a direct question, and I need the actual answer. He said, okay. She said, is Ella safe? Not safe as I can premise. Actually safe. He said, yes. She said, and me? He said, yes. Since Achibi, the exposure was always lateral. It came in from outside, not from inside. If you were mine, and I know you weren't, I know that he would never have been able to use you. She sat with that for a moment, the strange grammar of it. If you were mine. She said, I need another month. He said, take whatever you need. She said, I need a month where you don't contact me, where I'm not thinking about this. A pause. He said, okay, she said. And then I want to talk, not to decide, just to talk. He said very quietly, okay? The month was 41 days. She wasn't counting, mostly. Ella's school had a February break, and they went to her mother's in Kingston and spent 5 days eating food Corinna hadn't had to cook and watching old movies and walking along the waterfront in the gray February cold. Her mother asked twice if she was all right, and both times Corinna said, yes, fine, just tired. And her mother said, you always say that. And Corinna said, I know, Mom, it's always true. She thought about Damian more than she'd planned to. Not with longing exactly, something more complicated, more annoying. She'd think about the way he'd said it's yours, with the flat finality of a man who meant it, and then immediately about the folder on his kitchen table, and the two men in the corner booth, and the particular horror of sitting across from someone you'd thought you knew and rereading them from the beginning. Finding all the things you hadn't seen, she'd reread Ella's father the same way, once. She was less surprised the second time, which she was not sure was progress. The man from the park was still at school pickup when they got back. She brought him a coffee from the café one afternoon, just set it on the bench beside him without a word, and walked away. He didn't call after her. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. She texted Damian on a Wednesday in March. If you want to meet, I'm free Saturday. He texted back in under 2 minutes. Yes, you pick. She picked a restaurant near her building, on purpose. Neutral enough, close enough that she could leave easily. Not a test exactly, just not a test. He was there when she arrived, which she'd expected. He looked different, not less like himself, but like more of himself somehow, like something he'd been carrying had been put down, and he was still working out how to stand without the weight of it. He'd ordered water. He was not looking at his phone. He looked up when she walked in, and his face did the thing she'd always found unfair, that small, involuntary shift like relief. They talked for 2 hours. She asked questions and he answered them. Not performing openness, actually answering, including the things that didn't make him look careful or principled, including the year he was 26, and made a decision he couldn't undo, including the way he'd justified each step from there, because the alternative had been to stop and look at himself directly, and he hadn't been ready to do that until she'd put the folder back on the table and said nothing, and driven home. He said, I don't know what legitimate looks like yet. I'm learning. She said, what are you doing? He said, consulting, actual consulting, financial restructuring for companies that are actually just companies. It's slower. She said, do you hate it? He said, no. That's the strange part. I thought I would. She said, Damian. He waited. She said, I'm not okay with what you were. I want you to know that. I'm not going to tell myself it was fine or that the distance made it different. It wasn't fine and it wasn't different. And you put Ella adjacent to something she should never have been adjacent to. He said, I know. She said, and I don't know what I'm doing here. He said, neither do I. She said, that is not reassuring. He said, I know that too. She looked at him across the table. At this man, she'd spent 2 years rearranging her understanding of, learning in layers, having to learn again. There was nothing clean about it. There was no version where she hadn't been in the dark for too long, where the knowing hadn't been frightening, where she could say with any honesty that it had simply been worth it. But there was also this. She knew exactly who he was now. Not the version she'd assembled from Tuesday coffees and long evenings, and the careful way he listened, the actual version. The one that included the folder and the men in the booth and the 12-minute drive across the city because he'd been close, and also the look on his face when she'd asked, is Ella safe? And the flat, final way he'd said, take whatever you need. She said, I want to try. Not jump back in. Try. Slowly. He said, how slowly? She said, I'll let you know. He said, fair enough. She paid for her own dinner. He didn't argue. They walked out together and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, and he said goodnight, and she said goodnight, and she walked the 2 blocks home and went upstairs and found Ella awake past her bedtime, watching something on a tablet she was not supposed to have in bed. Ella looked at her. Corinna said, that stays hidden before school tomorrow. Ella said, obviously. Corinna sat on the edge of the bed. Do you remember Damian? Ella considered. The coffee man? Yes, you were weird about him. I was. I might see him again sometimes. If that's okay. Ella weighed this with the gravity of 8-year-olds. Is he nice? He's trying to be. That's not the same thing. No, Corinna said. But it's a start. Ella accepted this with a shrug that had the generosity of someone who'd decided not to make a thing of it right now, reserved the right to revisit later. She burrowed back under her blanket. Corinna turned the lamp down and sat in the half-dark for a while, listening to the sound of the street below, the February cold pressing against the window, the particular quiet of a city that never actually went silent. She thought about her father and what he would have said. She thought he would have worried, and then, once the worrying had run its course, he would have asked if she was choosing from a clear head or from a lonely one, and she would have had to think about it for a while before she could answer. She was choosing from a clear head. She was also lonely sometimes. The two things were both true, and she was learning to let them be true at the same time without deciding that one canceled the other out. Downstairs, the cafe was locked and dark, and the chairs were up on the tables, and the espresso machine was clean and ready for tomorrow. She had built that place herself from a failing lease and second-hand equipment and 4 years of 6 in the morning starts. She'd built Ella, more or less, in the same way, from materials that weren't quite what she'd planned for, in conditions that weren't ideal, with results she was mostly proud of and occasionally baffled by. She could build something else, not the same way as before, not in the dark, but from here, from this specific cleared ground, with the full picture in front of her, instead of the version she'd been handed. That was something. She turned the lamp off. She went to bed. Somewhere across the city, she knew without checking, someone was watching the street in front of her building. She hadn't decided yet how to feel about that, but she slept, and the sleep was quiet, and in the morning she got up before 6 and went downstairs and made coffee and stood at the window, watching snow fall soft and steady over the street. And for the first time in a long time, the weight in her chest felt less like something pressing down and more like something she was strong enough to carry.